Hello and welcome to the Endurance Science Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to cut through the noise and misinformation that social media provides and go through what the science really says about endurance performance. My name is Matt Carpenter. I'm a lecturer in sports science at the University of Northampton, doing my PhD in endurance exercise performance, specifically looking at dietary changes and supplements that may enhance exercise performance. And today's episode is on the importance of being good at fat burning during exercise and taking a dive into the evidence of, firstly, how do we burn fat during exercise? Secondly, what type of events is this important for? And what type of events is it less important for? Methods that you can use to test your ability to burn fat as well. And then methods of increasing fat oxidation. So hopefully an interesting one today, a topic that I think is really interesting. And there's some research on this that I don't think gets spoken about enough, some really neat research within exercise performance. Before we get into it, just a quick announcement that if anyone wants to get a VO2 max test done with lactate thresholds included, we're running those at the University of Northampton. So if you're interested in understanding your VO2 max, your lactate thresholds, please reach out to me. I can send you the requisite links you can look into so you can get some data to help enhance your training and performance. Anyway, fat oxidation. What is it? Why is it important? So when we're doing endurance exercise, we're predominantly burning carbohydrate or fat. And this tends to work on a bit of a sliding scale. You're never burning one or the other. It's always a combination of the two. But it tends to be that at lower intensities, you burn more fat relative to carbohydrate. And as intensity goes up and up and up, you burn more carbohydrate and less fat. The reason for this is that carbohydrate is an easier source of energy to obtain for the body. We need ATP for our body to run, and that is our currency of energy. And carbohydrate can provide that energy at a quicker rate. And so as we increase our intensity of exercise, our ATP demand goes up. The harder exercise is, the more ATP, the more energy we need to fuel that exercise. And carbohydrate can get us that ATP a little bit more quickly and a little bit more efficiently. And so as exercise intensity goes up, we burn more carbohydrate. But there's a downside to this. The downside is that our carbohydrate stores, as we discussed last week, are finite. 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate stores on us as glycogen. Fat oxidation is essentially unlimited. And I say this, and quite often when I say this and I'm teaching, I feel like I'm insulting people. It's not me calling people overweight. Even lean athletes, people lining up on the elite start line of the London Marathon, of the Olympics, etc., have, for all intents and purposes, unlimited fat stores. Okay, and that in practice looks like 30 to 60,000 calories worth of fat on their body at any given point that can be used for energy. And so we have two main sources of fat. There are intramuscular triglycerides, it's our fat stored within the muscle. And then we have our adipose tissue that we can break down through lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. And we can use that for energy as well. And the reason I think this is such an interesting topic is, number one, there's some really neat research using vitamin B3 to look at the role of fat oxidation, which I'll explain in a second. And on top of that, it's a topic that my view has changed on fairly recently based on some recent data. And so I want to talk about why my position has changed on how to, or the importance of fat during exercise, and the research behind that. For a long time now, I've spoken about the importance of fat oxidation. That really stemmed from both my research into ketogenic diets and the rationale for ketogenic diets being that it increases fat oxidation. But also I came across a paper in 2017 by Franzen et al., and they looked at fat oxidation rates in Ironman triathletes. And they found a positive correlation between fat oxidation and performance in the triathlon, Ironman distances was. So what you see there is people that are better at burning fat tend to do better in these long distance events. Now, when we're looking at Ironman triathlons, we're looking at, 8 to 12 hours or so. So these are really extreme events. But the rationale persists that fat oxidation becomes more important as exercise intensity gets longer and longer and longer, because it's harder to hold on to those carbohydrate stores. And so one question that is a really important one to address is, at what distance does fat oxidation become important? And this is vital for people that are running, say, 10Ks, half marathons, and thinking, does this matter to me? And so luckily, we've got a couple of really nice studies that I think illustrate when fat oxidation becomes something that is worth considering. And these are both done using nicotinic acid, or niacin, also known as vitamin B3. Vitamin B3, when taken at a high dose, suppresses fat oxidation. It suppresses lipolysis, so our ability to break down adipose tissue, and therefore fat oxidation goes down. So what you can do, and what researchers have done, is choose a certain event, a type of exercise, and give people nicotinic acid. And what happens when you give that vitamin B3 at the requisite dose is that it massively increases your use of carbohydrate and decreases your use of fat. And so the question you can ask then is, does this impact exercise performance at a range of different distances? Does it impact short duration, moderate duration, long duration? And you get to a kind of sweet spot of where fat oxidation starts to become important. And so there are two studies that have looked at this really nicely, okay? Both out of the Australian Institute of Sport, as is so often the case when it comes to exercise metabolism research. And the first was Leckie et al. 2016, and they looked at nicotinic acid or vitamin B3 ingestion in half marathon performance. Here they had some pretty good male athletes, so average VO2 max of 64 milliliters per kilogram per minute, half marathon PBs of about 80 minutes or so 1 hour, 20 minutes. And what they did was they got these athletes to compete 4 treadmill runs to fatigue at about 95% of their best half marathon pace. So going just slower than their best half marathon pace for as long as they could in a time to exhaustion. Okay. And what they wanted to look at mainly here, and they used a number of different protocols, but what they wanted to look at was, do athletes perform worse once they've consumed nicotinic acid? So does suppressing fat oxidation impact performance? And what they found was, firstly, the nicotinic acid successfully suppressed fat oxidation. So we can tell by looking at metabolic cart data that carbohydrate oxidation was higher, fat oxidation was very low. But that didn't have any impact on exercise performance, okay? And so here, the ability to burn fat wasn't impacting performance. And this is really important because then we can say, if someone's goal is to run a half marathon or an event lasting around an hour and a half, being a good fat burner actually doesn't necessarily make a difference. And in any case, if you're running to a high level, you're probably good enough at burning fat that it won't matter. So fat oxidation in these half marathon events, and we say up to about an hour and a half in this case, because these are pretty good athletes, wasn't impacting performance. What happens when you lengthen that out though? And that's what Torrens et al. 2016 did. And they looked, using cycling instead of running, they looked at time trial performance in a similar group of athletes in terms of VO2 max in the early 60s. And they used 6 time trials with 3 durations, roughly 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and 120 minutes. And they wanted to look again at, does nicotinic acid impair performance? And they found, in support of the work of Leckie before, that in 60-minute and 90-minute roughly durations, there was no impact of nicotinic acid on performance. So you suppress fat oxidation, it doesn't make performance worse over 60 minutes or over 90 minutes, but it did over 120 minutes. So you hit that 2-hour mark, that's when nicotinic acid impaired performance. So blocking the ability to burn fat made exercise performance worse over the duration of 2 hours. And so they found a 2.4% reduction in performance, so about 3-minute difference, with a notable decline in power output, particularly in the final third of the ride. They link this to potentially falling blood glucose and also decreased muscle glycogen, topics we covered last week. And so what do these 2 studies tell us about the importance of fat oxidation? Well, it creates quite a nice story, to be honest, in the sense of 60 to 90 minutes worth of exercise, the rates of fat oxidation aren't having much of an effect on performance. But as duration gets longer, and it seems that at that 2-hour mark, fat oxidation suddenly becomes important. And at that stage, nicotinic acid ingestion that suppresses your ability to burn fat does negatively impact performance. So at 2 hours, it's important to be able to burn fat. Lovely. But what does that mean for people listening to this podcast? What does it mean for your performance? Well, there's a number of really interesting takeaways from this work. The first one, and the thing that's really important to note, is that in this study, they were artificially suppressing fat oxidation. Now, it's very rare you find someone that doesn't burn any fat at all. And so for a 2-hour event, for example, most people are probably burning enough fat if they've trained enough to be able to get through without any performance impairment. But what you can see from this research, and it helps create that narrative, that the longer exercise duration goes on, the more important fat oxidation is. And so when you almost completely suppress fat oxidation, or do it as well as we can with nicotinic acid, at 2 hours, exercise becomes impaired. But most people burn enough fat for that to probably not happen. But as you get to, say, 2.5 to 3 hours and beyond, and we start to look at things like marathons, ultra marathons, well, that's where being conscious of your fat oxidation capacity and understanding the importance of fat burning might become more important. And again, linking back nicely to the Franzen 2017 paper that showed that correlation between fat oxidation and exercise performance. And so we can see that fat oxidation is important, but it's context that matters. It's that duration of event that makes fat oxidation relevant. And this is where I've changed my mind on something quite recently. And if you've listened to my previous episodes, you hopefully will see the sort of narrative along this podcast. But I used to then teach to both athletes and my students that you have two ways of preventing carbohydrate depletion. Because if we take a step back, what is fat oxidation doing? It's helping us save or spare our carbohydrate stores. The more fat we're burning, the less carbohydrate we're burning. And the less carbohydrate we're burning, the longer our own carbohydrate stores last. And so I used to teach that you have two ways of sparing carbohydrate. You have increasing your fat oxidation, or you have carbohydrate consumption during exercise. So I would give these kind of two ways of doing it. It doesn't mean you could never do both, but kind of two sides of the same coin. Of you can either work on increasing your fat oxidation, or you can work on training your gut and increase your ability to consume carbohydrate during exercise. Now, that's where I've changed my mind recently. I think actually recent research is making the case for fat oxidation more than I previously did. And that comes down to the Rothschild et al. 2025 meta-analysis looking at muscle glycogen and how it's impacted by carbohydrate feeding. I discussed this last week, so I won't go into loads of detail. But long story short, they reported that muscle glycogen is spared by taking carbohydrate in whilst you exercise. So taking your gels does slow down the rate of muscle glycogen breakdown, but it doesn't do a great job of it. So it slows it down, but not by that much. And what that tells us is that of those two tools we have of sparing carbohydrate, which are increasing fat oxidation and consuming our carbohydrate drinks or our carbohydrate gels during our endurance performance, one of them is a lot better than the other. And that is training your fat oxidation. Now, again, you can do both, but it really highlights, particularly as we go into those longer duration events, your marathons and beyond, that if you are not good at burning fat, actually consuming gels or consuming carbohydrate drinks at your high rates, 90 grams an hour, might not be enough to save your muscle glycogen. And there's some really interesting sort of background to this, because I would typically teach the importance of fat oxidation, and in part what increasing your fat oxidation is doing, I would teach, is that it's reducing your need for carbohydrate during exercise. The data on GI issues for particularly ultra endurance athletes is unbelievably high, really high rates of GI issues. And even going down to a marathon, GI issues are very common. So I would teach that if you can increase your reliance on fat, you reduce your need for carbohydrate and therefore reduce your chance of GI issues. But even more so now, in the knowledge that carbohydrate consumption isn't great at sparing muscle glycogen, even more it tells us that for those long duration events, you've got to be good at burning fat. And so this again brings us to Franzen's paper, which I think told us so much in 2017, which is that if you're good at burning fat, it provides a fantastic pillar of marathon and beyond ultramarathon performance. Without that fat oxidation capacity, then it's going to be really difficult to perform in those long distance events. I think it's really important to talk about the importance of fat oxidation because the endurance community and social media are obsessed with carbohydrate. And I say this as someone who's just done 2 podcasts in a row on carbohydrate, but it seems like we are absolutely hell-bent on talking about carbohydrate, and sometimes the importance of fat oxidation can get lost. And so hopefully you've had some decent context there of when does fat oxidation become important? And therefore there's a debate that goes on to say, is carbohydrate king or fat versus carbohydrate? But it's never one or the other. It's all about that context. Fat becomes progressively more important the longer exercise is. We all know that fat is an important fuel for long efforts, but this just highlights how important, and it's been really neatly shown by that kind of pharmacological trick that we use with nicotinic acid, vitamin B3, to essentially switch off fat burning and see at what distance will this impact performance. And so this leads us to the second part of this podcast. And I always want to make sure that what I'm focusing on in this podcast is theory and science, and then leading to what does this mean for people, or what can you do about this? And so the next question that often comes is, right, okay, I understand, I get your point, fat oxidation is important. What can I do to improve my fat oxidation? And this is where research isn't quite as clear cut as I'd like. And there are a couple of very clear ways. So there are 2 strategies that are very effective at increasing fat oxidation. And then there's a lot of kind of noise and uncertainty within the literature. And so I want to talk about those things as well. And the beauty of having a longer form podcast is that we can talk about uncertainty, and I can talk about things that may not have great evidence, but I would still suggest athletes use because there are chances that they improve performance and they improve fat oxidation. And so let's start off with the two well-researched ways to increase fat oxidation. The first one, as boring as it is training volume. Okay. The more you train, the better you become at burning fat. It's an adaptation to exercise to get better at fat oxidation and to be able to burn fat at higher intensities. And so training volume is a really important part of training. And one of those reasons is that it increases your ability to burn fat. And so there's no substitute for volume within your training. And that's another reason why most people that are doing, say, maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours worth of exercise probably don't need to actively worry about fat oxidation, because just doing your training, you'll be burning enough fat for it to not impair your performance. But as duration gets longer and longer and you need to become more conscious of fat oxidation, that's where you might want to employ other tools. And unfortunately, there's only really a couple of other clear ways of increasing fat oxidation. And it's important to note that just because something improves fat oxidation doesn't automatically mean it improves performance, because we're working on our human body that is impacted by many, many things. And an intervention that does one thing also may do many others. And so just because it increases fat oxidation doesn't mean it's necessarily an endorsement. But with that caveat included, the best way to increase your ability to burn fat by an absolute mile is to drop carbohydrate. And there are levels to this. Now, my PhD is largely on ketogenic diets, and we can see within a week, someone going from a fairly mixed metabolism of burning fat and carbohydrate to burning almost solely fat during steady state intensity. And that occurs, like I say, rapidly within a week. And so you can really increase your ability to burn fat. Now, the interesting thing here is that there seems to be a fairly linear relationship between carbohydrate intake and fat oxidation. And so just saying dropping carbohydrate increases fat oxidation doesn't quite tell the whole story, because it doesn't mean that, okay, the alternative to carbs is no carbs. There's a spectrum. And so my suggestion to many people is that it isn't about taking all your carbohydrate out of your diet. Most people don't want to do that. Most people may not even benefit from doing that. But instead, a great strategy is to periodically keep carbohydrate low across certain sessions. Now, the important thing here is that acute changes are probably not that important. So what I mean by that is doing the odd session here and there, or doing a week low carb, for example, or a week of keto, even 4 weeks of keto, might not long-term impact your fat oxidation. And this is something that recent research is starting to show. There was a recent paper that looked at a periodized carbohydrate approach where there are 3 groups. And over 8 weeks, one group was high carb, one group was low carb, and one group did 4 weeks low carb and 4 weeks back high carb. And my prediction would have been that 4 weeks low carb, 4 weeks high carb group was still burning more fat at the end. They had an adaptation to those 4 weeks that persisted. And I actually did a case study on this that showed kind of similar, but not as rigorous as this study. So that would have been my prediction, my hypothesis. But actually, they reported that there was no change in fat oxidation at 8 weeks between the high carb group, the one that were eating carbohydrate the whole time, compared to the periodized carbohydrate group that went keto for 4 weeks and then went back to their carbohydrates for 4 weeks afterwards. No difference in fat oxidation. And so periods of carbohydrate restriction may not be as effective as I would have thought and many people would have thought. And so the alternative to that are essentially prolonged or chronic changes. And that doesn't mean dropping all carbohydrate. So there's one nice way of combining endurance training or increasing volume and training with low carbohydrate availability. And so part of the reason that dropping carbohydrate increases your fat oxidation is that when you're training with low carbohydrate availability, you're upregulating the enzymes involved in fat oxidation, things like CPT1 that's essential to get your fat from the blood eventually all the way into the muscles to get broken down. And so what you can do is, rather than dropping carbohydrate, which may not be a strategy many people want to go to, is one of a few things. So one strategy would be to drop carbohydrate to an extent, but not all the way down to, say, ketogenics. Look at how much carbohydrate you're ingesting and play around with dropping it 20%, 30%, 40%. And that may well have a long-term impact on your fat oxidation. So going from a high carbohydrate to a mixed carbohydrate-based diet is likely one way of increasing your fat oxidation. And that, rather than being a short-term change, is something you can do over the long term. And what will happen is, because of that, if you drop from, say, 500 grams of carbohydrate a day down to 200, 250, is that over time, your body will increase fat oxidation for your steady state sessions, for all sessions. And so you may find that you have reduced need for carbohydrate fueling during exercise, and you're able to burn fat more effectively as you get towards your race. Another strategy is to periodize carbohydrate. Now, this is where research gets a little bit messy, because actually the data on periodized carbohydrates week to week isn't overly clear on whether it can actually increase fat oxidation. This is likely, I would suggest, because of the short-term nature of most research. It just doesn't pick up on an effect. But training under low carbohydrate availability is an effective way of increasing signaling of fat-related enzymes. And therefore, one would expect over time, if you're doing that a lot, it would increase your ability to burn fat. Now, this is where there is some slight messiness in the research, in that research looking at fasted training is actually quite mixed on whether it increases fat oxidation. It may well not increase fat oxidation in the long term. Saying that, I don't think there's enough research to fully rule out the potential of things like fasted exercise training to increase fat oxidation. But my suggestion often is a mixture of increasing volume and training with low carbohydrate availability. And one really good way of doing this is to use double training days and to not refeed massively with carbohydrate between the sessions. Now, if you're trying to copy the Norwegian method and do 2 threshold sessions, you obviously want carbohydrate between those. Don't go restricting carbohydrate for hard sessions. But if you're training for a long distance event, then actually having 2 fairly easy sessions in a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, and not refeeding too much with carbohydrate between those, making sure you still eat, but not with loads of carbohydrate, means you'll be starting the session with low carbohydrate availability, that second session, and you may get some prolonged adaptation to that. And again, the research on this isn't as clear as you'd like it to be, but you have to kind of use a combination of theory and research to develop these ideas and understandings. And so the short answer really is that there's no clearer way to increase fat oxidation than to train more, which most people want to do anyway. And then on top of that, if it's something that you really are concerned about, so maybe if you're running an ultra marathon or doing an ultra endurance cycling event, then that's when you may want to start manipulating carbohydrate. And my 2 suggestions there are playing around with dropping your daily carbohydrate intake, not massively, but just subtly decreasing carbohydrate day to day and increasing fat and protein accordingly. And on top of that, potentially using things like double training days as a way of both increasing volume and training with low carbohydrate availability to potentially increase fat oxidation long term. Now, there is a supplement here that is gaining my interest, and that's the New Zealand blackcurrant extract. And some recent data suggested that New Zealand blackcurrant extract ingestion seems to increase fat oxidation during exercise. And so that's something I'm going to be keeping a close eye on, and that may well be something that's utilized within the ultra endurance space as another method of increasing fat oxidation. Possibly too early to recommend that at the moment, but it's something I'm keeping a close eye on. I'm hoping to potentially get some research done on it soon as well, because nothing more interesting than studying ultra endurance athletes. So that is an interesting one, but I think right now, unfortunately, if only it was clear, if only it was simple, the best way of increasing your fat oxidation is through training and potentially dietary modifications. Now, like I say, if someone drops their carbohydrate and feels dreadful and their training is down, they can't get it back up, well, then it's likely that that isn't going to work for you. I would say, to caveat that though, that most people, once they've adapted to dropping carbohydrates, even all the way down to very low, actually don't experience a decrease in performance. That very much depends on, firstly, the individual, but also making sure you do consume enough energy. So if you are considering dropping carbohydrate to an extent, make sure you're conscious of your calorie consumption. So you're making sure you consume the same number of calories, but just through differences in the macronutrient ratio would be my suggestion if you're playing around with that. And this is supported by some really recent data, 2026, which looked at fat oxidation and how fat oxidation is impacted by low energy availability compared to low carbohydrate availability. So essentially, the difference between consuming insufficient calories and consuming sufficient calories, but less carbohydrate. This was Dunlop et al. 2026, published in Physiological Reports, and they looked at elite athletes restricting in their diet. And they wanted to look at, is the reduction in total energy or the restriction of carbohydrates specifically the change driving the biggest metabolic adaptations or disruptions? And they found it was a drop in carbohydrate rather than the drop in total energy that was causing the change in metabolic profile. And so they found that the low energy availability group's metabolic profile actually looked very similar to just a traditional high carbohydrate diet. Okay. But it was the carbohydrate restriction that caused the big diversions. And so particularly your enzymes involved with fat oxidation were all significantly increased with the low carbohydrate diet rather than the low energy availability. We also saw higher serum free fatty acids, so free fatty acids in the blood, and an increase in beta hydroxybutyrate. And so what you see there is that these adaptations, all related to increased fat oxidation, come through carbohydrate restriction rather than dropping energy availability. So it's really important to avoid low energy availability to make sure you can maintain your training volume. And this also adds to the rationale that periods of low carbohydrate availability will support long-term changes in fat oxidation. So if we're to go through like an evidence tier list of things to increase your fat oxidation, the two that are top tier are training volume and carbohydrate intake day to day. So if you drop your carbohydrate intake, you increase your fat oxidation. If you train more, you increase your fat oxidation. But the kind of tier below that has very clear theoretical rationale, but maybe not quite as much long-term research as I'd like, is training with low carbohydrate availability. And so if I was working with an ultra endurance athlete, I would always suggest low carbohydrate periods for, say, double training days and things like a fasted training session a week, coinciding with easy sessions. So fairly straightforward, easy, low intensity sessions that can be done fasted without drops in training quality. And what you get there are adaptations specific to increased fat oxidation. So lots of intermediates of beta oxidation, which is the breaking down of free fatty acids for energy. Big takeaway from these recommendations I'm making are, if you are going to do things like fasted training or you are going to drop carbohydrate day to day, it's really important to avoid dropping energy intake, because that's going to have a negative impact on your training performance itself, which is then going to have a negative impact on adaptation. And so it's really important to not drop energy availability, and the low energy availability doesn't itself increase any kind of adaptation. So it's a warning against that, because it can be difficult, particularly for people with high training volumes, to maintain caloric intake when they're dropping carbohydrate. And so to conclude that paper, it's the carbohydrate restriction, not the energy restriction, that's rewiring your metabolism to oxidize fat. Okay. And so it's a really important consideration when it comes to how can you increase fat oxidation for performance. And so whilst there isn't clear long-term evidence that periodized carbohydrate intake increases fat oxidation, I think we've got enough mechanistically, particularly with this recent Dunlop paper, to tell us that it's a nice middle ground if you want to maintain carbohydrate intake, but you want to increase your fat oxidation. A nice middle ground is to periodize carbohydrate and use fasted training sessions or sessions under low glycogen availability to potentially increase fat oxidation. And that might be more appealing to people than dropping carbohydrate. And so final thing is, how do I know if I need to get better at burning fat? And this is where I'm a really big fan of maximal fat oxidation testing. And so testing your ability to burn fat in a lab condition that can measure fat oxidation can be a really effective way of seeing what your current metabolism is looking like. Now, this is something we're hoping to get in very soon at Northampton. If there is any interest, please drop me a message, because it's really good for us to get an idea of whether people are looking for this, because not many places offer it. But understanding your fat oxidation rates will tell you, firstly, whether any kind of intervention in yourself is needed. You might find that you're burning enough fat or plenty of fat that you don't need to actually make any other considerations. Whereas you might find, and something that I saw quite regularly when I was testing for my PhD, is that some really well-trained ultra endurance athletes were still not very good at burning fat. And that's where intervention may be beneficial. So to summarize this episode, fat oxidation is important when you get beyond 2 hours, and more important than even I previously believed. Now, there are a number of ways you can increase fat oxidation. The top two are increasing your training volume and dropping carbohydrate day to day. But both of these might not be feasible if your training volume is already high and you struggle with dropping carbohydrates. And so a secondary approach that has clear mechanistic rationale, not quite as much research directly studying this as we would like, but something I would be pretty confident would increase fat oxidation, is periodizing carbohydrate so you train with low carbohydrate availability at times. And the most important thing here is making sure that it isn't negatively impacting your training and that you're consistent with it. And so, for example, you might have 1 to 2 sessions a week that you identify that you can train with low carbohydrate availability. For example, an easy morning run, and then maybe on a double training day, that afternoon run, you'll therefore have low carbohydrate availability as well. So a way you can get it into your own training to increase fat oxidation. And so these are the key takeaways from this episode. As always, the 3 papers I've discussed in detail today, I'll put into the show notes. They're really good ones, and I really love the research on nicotinic acid. I'm really pleased to have a longer form platform that I can talk about it on, because I don't really see it ever getting spoken about. I'll be surprised if people not within the research space have come across it before. And it's a really cool little way to manipulate substrate oxidation or substrate metabolism and see how it impacts performance. So hopefully a really interesting side of research that many people hadn't come across before, that I'm really happy to champion and give a little platform to. So hope that was interesting. If you've got any topic ideas for future episodes, then as always, please reach out. I've been really enjoying doing these over the last few weeks. This is episode 4 now, and I've got no plans on changing anything for a while. Long term, we'll be getting some guests on. I've already been talking to a few people that I'd love to get on, both researchers themselves and people working in the field, to discuss how they bring science into the real world. So lots of really exciting things for this podcast. Please do drop me a rating if you haven't already. I really appreciate that. Helps me get pushed up those podcast ratings and hopefully bring science to more people that are interested in endurance performance. Other than that, have a great week, and I'll see you all next time.